1942, and the world was at war. In the vast desert of Libya, far from the battles raging across Europe and Africa, a baby boy was born in a small tent. His name was Muammar Gaddafi, and he would grow up to become one of the most famous and controversial leaders in modern history. The desert taught him many lessons that would stay with him forever. It showed him that life was a constant struggle, that only the strong survived, and that a person must never give up even when facing impossible odds. Gaddafi was born in Qasr Abu Hadi, a tiny village near the coastal town of Sirte. He decided to send his school in the nearest town. There, he learned to read and write in Arabic, studied the Quran, and discovered subjects like history and geography. For the first time, he began to understand how big the world really was. He learned about other countries, other peoples, and other ways of life. This knowledge both excited and frustrated him. This was not common among the Bedouin people, who preferred their children to learn the old ways of desert life. When Britain, France, and Israel attacked Egypt, he organized student demonstrations in support of Nasser. They expelled him from school and warned him to stop his political activities. There he continued his studies while also continuing his political activities. This was a crucial step in his plan to gain the power needed for revolution. At the academy, he studied military tactics, weapons, and leadership. But more importantly, he recruited other young officers to join his cause. This experience in the West only reinforced his belief that foreign powers were exploiting Arab countries. He saw the wealth and power of Britain and contrasted it with the poverty and weakness of his own country. This made him more determined than ever to free Libya from foreign control. They knew they would have only one chance to succeed. The revolution that would change everything was just months away. Failure would mean death or imprisonment. But success would give them the power to reshape, not only Libya, but the entire Arab world. He was careful to choose only those who shared his vision of a free and united Arab world. He formed a secret organization called the Free Officers Movement, inspired by the group that had brought Nasser to power in Egypt. The young revolutionaries met in secret, planning and preparing for the day when they would overthrow the Libyan monarchy. This setback only made him more determined to fight for his beliefs. They had spent years planning, recruiting, and preparing. The Free Officers Movement now included dozens of young military officers who were committed to revolution. They had studied the successes and failures of other military coups around the world. They knew that their moment had arrived. He gave passionate speeches calling for Arab unity and the expulsion of foreign forces from Arab lands. It was one of the poorest nations in the world, with most of its people living in poverty despite the discovery of vast oil reserves. The monarchy was widely seen as corrupt and subservient to foreign interests. The time was ripe for change, and Muammar Gaddafi, the desert boy who had become a revolutionary officer, was ready to provide it. His instructors later remembered him as a serious young man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He rarely smiled, rarely joked, and always seemed to be thinking about something important. Even at this young age, he showed the charisma and determination that would later make him a powerful leader. But the young Gaddafi could see that his country was not truly free. Foreign companies controlled the oil that was being discovered beneath the desert sand. British and American military bases dotted the landscape. Nasser had come to power in 1952 through a military coup, and he preached a message of Arab nationalism, socialism, and anti-imperialism. For young Gaddafi, Nasser became a hero and a role model. He memorized Nasser's speeches and dreamed of following in his footsteps. Most Libyans remained poor while foreigners grew rich from their country's resources. But Abu Minir could see that his son was special, and he wanted him to have opportunities that he himself had never had. In Sebha, he met other young Arabs who shared his frustration with the state of their country and the Arab world in general. They would gather in secret to discuss politics, dream of revolution, and plan for a better future. His father, Abu Minir, was a poor Bedouin herder who owned nothing but a few goats and camels. The family lived the traditional nomadic life, moving their black tents from place to place as the seasons changed. They were not wealthy or powerful, but they had their pride and their traditions. While his friends were content to play simple games and help with the family animals, He was always asking questions about the world beyond the desert. He wanted to know why some people were rich while others were poor, why foreigners controlled so much of Libya, and why the Arab people seemed divided and weak. Abu Munir was a man of few words but strong principles. He taught his son to be proud of his heritage and never to bow down to anyone, no matter how powerful they might be. They followed the rain and the grass, always searching for better pastures for their animals. Life in the desert was hard but simple. Young Muammar learned to milk goats, tend sheep, and survive in the harsh environment where water was precious and shade was rare. The Gaddafi family was part of the Gaddafi tribe, one of the smaller Bedouin groups in Libya. As a child, Muammar was different from other boys his age. When Muammar was 6 years old, his father made a decision that would change everything. The boy walked many miles to reach the small school in Sirte. Libya, at that time, was ruled by King Idris, who had come to power after the country gained independence from Italy in 1951. When Muammar was 14, his father sent him to continue his education in Sebha, a larger town in the south. This was where his political awakening truly began. It was during this time that Gaddafi discovered the writings and speeches of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had a profound impact on the teenage Gaddafi. But Gaddafi's political activities got him into trouble. The school authorities, loyal to King Idris, did not appreciate his revolutionary speeches. Undeterred, Gaddafi found another school in Misrata, a coastal city. In 1963, at the age of 21, Gaddafi entered the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi. Gaddafi was not the most brilliant student at the academy, but he was certainly the most determined. During his military training, Gaddafi also spent time in Britain, where he took a course in military communications. By 1969, Gaddafi and his fellow conspirators felt ready to act. The Libya that Gaddafi was preparing to transform was a country of contrasts. As 1969 progressed, the young colonel and his conspirators put the finishing touches on their plans. The boy who had once herded goats in the desert was about to become the leader of a nation. The night of August 31, 1969 was like any other summer night in Libya. The desert air was still warm from the day's heat, and most people were sleeping peacefully in their homes. King Idris was thousands of miles away in Turkey, receiving medical treatment at a health spa. At just 27 years old, he was about to attempt something that could either make him the leader of Libya or cost him his life. There was no turning back now. His government ministers were relaxed, believing their country was stable and secure. None of them knew that by morning everything would change forever. Gaddafi and his fellow conspirators in the Free Officers movement had been watching and waiting for the right moment. With the king out of the country and many senior officials on vacation, they knew this was their best chance. They had to move quickly and quietly, taking control of key locations before anyone could stop them. Captain Muammar Gaddafi could not sleep that night. He had been planning this moment for years, and now it was finally here. It was one of the most peaceful military coups in history. The old government had simply melted away like ice in the desert sun. Small groups of young officers moved through the darkness toward their targets. Some headed for the main army barracks in Tripoli and Benghazi. Others went to the radio stations, telephone exchanges, and government buildings. Each group knew exactly what they had to do. His words were broadcast across Libya and beyond, announcing the birth of a new nation. He spoke in Arabic, his voice trembling with excitement and emotion. "People of Libya," he declared, "your country is now free. The corrupt monarchy that sold your land to foreigners is finished." Many people had been unhappy with King Idris, who seemed more interested in his own comfort than in helping his people. They welcomed the promise of change. Others were worried about what would happen next. They announced that they had no intention of harming anyone who had served under the old government. The revolutionaries moved quickly to transform Libya from a monarchy into a republic. They changed the name of the country from the Kingdom of Libya to the Libyan Arab Republic. The Americans and British were told they had 6 months to pack up and leave. This was a bold move that showed the world that Libya would no longer be controlled by foreign powers. The young revolutionaries were serious about independence and sovereignty. They adopted a new flag with red, white, and black stripes. representing the struggle for independence, the pure intentions of the revolution, and the dark days of oppression that were now ending. They promised to respect Islam and traditional values while building a modern, progressive society. Gaddafi was not officially the leader at first, but his charisma and vision quickly made him the most important figure in the group. His speeches were filled with references to Arab unity, social justice, and the struggle against imperialism. He often spoke for hours, his voice rising and falling with emotion as he described his vision for Libya's future. Within months, everyone understood that he was the real power behind the revolution. The old order was gone, and a new Libya was being born. The desert boy who had once herded goats was now the leader of a nation with vast oil reserves and unlimited potential. Building a new society would prove much harder than overthrowing the old one. And the world was watching to see what this mysterious revolutionary would do next. The new government demanded higher payments for Libya's oil and greater control over the industry. The foreign companies had been used to dealing with weak governments that accepted whatever terms were offered. Now they faced determined negotiators who knew the value of their country's resources. They said they would use Libya's oil wealth to benefit all Libyans, not just a wealthy few. Would there be fighting? Would the economy collapse? Would foreign countries invade to restore the old government? Today begins a new era of freedom, socialism, and unity. The Cold War was at its height, and both the United States and Soviet Union were trying to figure out which side Libya would choose. Gaddafi's revolutionary rhetoric worried Western leaders, while his emphasis on Arab nationalism and socialism suggested he might align with the Soviet bloc. He studied the experiences of other revolutionary leaders like Nasser in Egypt, Castro in Cuba, and Mao in China. He wanted to learn from their successes and avoid their mistakes. Most importantly, he wanted to prove that a small country like Libya could become a major force in world affairs. The plan was simple but required perfect timing. Foreign governments had been caught completely off guard. The Americans had military bases in Libya and were worried about what this meant for their interests. The British were concerned about their oil investments. The Soviets were curious about whether this new government might become an ally. At exactly midnight, the revolution began. The most important target was the radio station in Benghazi. Gaddafi knew that whoever controlled the radio could speak to the entire nation. If they could announce their success before the government could respond, half the battle would be won. The revolutionaries were amazed at how easy it was. Most of the soldiers they encountered either joined them immediately or simply laid down their weapons. Many had been waiting for someone to stand up against the corrupt monarchy. The revolution they had dreamed of was finally happening. The young officers who reached the radio station found only a few sleepy guards who surrendered without a fight. Meanwhile, other groups were taking control of military bases across the country. By dawn, the free officers had control of all the major cities. Not a single shot had been fired. Not one person had been killed. At 6:30 in the morning, Gaddafi's voice crackled over Radio Benghazi. The announcement came as a complete shock to the world. But for ordinary Libyans, the news brought a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Gaddafi and his fellow officers quickly moved to reassure the people. The new government called itself the Revolutionary Command Council. It consisted of 12 young officers, all under the age of 30. The first year of the new government was a time of rapid change. One of their first major actions was to close the foreign military bases. The oil companies were next to feel the impact of the revolution. Gaddafi himself became the public face of the revolution. He appeared at rallies and public events, always wearing his military uniform and speaking passionately about the need for change. The international community watched these developments with growing concern. But Gaddafi was determined to chart his own course. As 1970 began, it was clear that the revolution had succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of its architects. The young colonel had won his first great victory. But the real challenges were just beginning. By 1970, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi had successfully taken control of Libya, but winning power was only the beginning. Now he faced a much bigger challenge: how to build a completely new kind of society. The young revolutionary was not content to simply copy what other countries had done. He wanted to create something entirely original, something that would show the world a better way to live. He wanted to create a system that combined the best parts of different ideologies while avoiding their weaknesses. This was an incredibly ambitious goal for a young man who had grown up herding goats in the desert, but Gaddafi was never lacking in confidence. His closest advisors would find him in the morning, surrounded by papers covered with his handwriting. He would excitedly explain his latest insights, speaking rapidly about how society should be organized and how people should govern themselves. The title was significant. Green was the color of Islam, but it was also the color of the Libyan Revolution. The book was thin, less than 100 pages, but Gaddafi believed it contained ideas that could change the world. In this system, there would be no traditional government. Instead, people would organize themselves into People-S committees and People-S congresses, where they would make decisions about their own lives and communities. Gaddafi rejected both capitalism and communism, calling them both forms of exploitation. He argued that workers should own the businesses where they worked, and that no one should be able to hire others to work for them. Gaddafi wrote about the role of women in society, the importance of family, and the need to preserve traditional values while embracing progress. He argued that men and women were naturally different but equally important, and that society should be organized to allow both to fulfill their natural roles. Partners, not wage workers, became one of his most famous slogans. Every citizen would participate directly in governing the country. Gaddafi spent countless hours in his office, reading books about politics, economics, and philosophy. Gaddafi argued that all existing forms of government were flawed because they separated the rulers from the ruled. Gaddafi established centers for the study of his theories in many countries. He genuinely believed that his ideas could solve the problems facing all of humanity, not just Libya. Students in universities studied the Green Book alongside other political texts. Revolutionary movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America incorporated some of his concepts into their own struggles. The Colonel became a celebrity on the international stage, invited to speak at conferences and meetings around the world. He saw himself as a great philosopher and revolutionary thinker, comparable to Marx or Lenin. In his view, true democracy meant that people should rule themselves directly, without representatives or intermediaries. He also became a champion of causes that he believed would advance human freedom and dignity. The United States and Britain viewed him as a dangerous radical who was destabilizing the world order. They began to impose economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure on Libya, trying to force Gaddafi to abandon his revolutionary activities. He provided financial support to liberation movements fighting against colonial rule in Africa. He sent money and weapons to groups fighting for independence in Ireland, Palestine, and other parts of the world. He abandoned the simple military uniform he had worn as a young revolutionary and began dressing in colorful robes and elaborate costumes. He grew his hair long and styled it in an afro. He often spoke without notes, letting his passion and conviction guide his words. These performances became legendary, broadcast on television and radio across the Arab world. He wanted to show that he was not just another military dictator, but a unique leader with a special mission. He studied the writings of famous thinkers from around the world. He read about capitalism and communism, democracy and dictatorship, socialism and free markets. Training camps were established in the desert where fighters learned guerrilla warfare tactics. His Green Book had made him famous as a political theorist, while his support for revolutionary movements had made him a hero to some and a villain to others. The poor boy from the desert had become a global figure whose ideas and actions would shape world events for decades to come. The country's embassies around the world became centers for supporting anti-government movements. Gaddafi saw himself as the leader of a worldwide revolution against oppression and injustice. But none of these systems satisfied him. He believed they all had serious flaws that made them unsuitable for Libya and the Arab world. The country was divided into hundreds of people's committees, each responsible for governing a small area or group of people. These committees were supposed to make decisions about everything from local services to national policy. Factory workers could decide how their workplace should be run. Students could choose what they wanted to study. He argued that the opposition from Western governments proved that his ideas were a real threat to the systems of exploitation and oppression that they represented. Local communities could decide how to spend their budgets. It was a bold experiment in direct democracy. The more he studied, the more convinced he became that he needed to develop his own political theory. While people could debate and vote in their committees, the really important decisions were still made by Gaddafi and his inner circle. The colonel had not given up power. He had simply created a new way of exercising it. He claimed to be just an ordinary citizen with no official title, but everyone knew he was still the real leader. He began writing down his ideas in notebooks, scribbling thoughts and theories late into the night. In 1975, Gaddafi published the first volume of what would become his most famous work, The Green Book. The Green Book began with a simple but revolutionary statement. The instrument of government is the primary political problem confronting human communities. He called his system Jamahiriya, which means state of the masses in Arabic. The second volume of The Green Book, published in 1977, dealt with economics. The third and final volume, published in 1979, addressed social issues. While Gaddafi was writing his theories, he was also trying to put them into practice in Libya. In theory, this system gave ordinary Libyans more power than they had ever had before. In practice, however, the system was more complicated. The Green Book was translated into dozens of languages and distributed around the world. Many people around the world were intrigued by Gaddafi's ideas. But Gaddafi's revolutionary ideology went beyond just political theory. Libya became a gathering place for revolutionaries from around the globe. This support for international revolution made Gaddafi many enemies, especially in Western countries. But the colonel was not intimidated by this pressure. If anything, it convinced him that he was on the right path. During this period, Gaddafi also began to develop his distinctive public persona. His speeches became longer and more theatrical. He would speak for hours at a time, gesturing dramatically and raising his voice to emphasize important points. By 1980, Gaddafi had established himself as one of the most controversial and influential leaders in the world. The 1980s began with Colonel Muammar Gaddafi feeling more confident than ever. He had ruled Libya for over a decade, his revolutionary ideas were spreading around the world, and his country's vast oil wealth gave him the power to challenge even the mightiest nations. But this decade would test him like never before, as he found himself locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse with the most powerful country on earth, the United States of America. Gaddafi had declared that the entire Gulf of Sidra belonged to Libya, drawing an imaginary line across the water that he called the Line of Death. He warned that any foreign military forces that crossed this line would be destroyed. The Americans saw this as an outrageous claim and decided to test Gaddafi's resolve. The trouble started with a new American president named Ronald Reagan. They claimed he was responsible for attacks on innocent civilians in airports, hotels, and other public places. They began to pressure their allies in Europe and elsewhere to join them in isolating Libya from the international community. Reagan was very different from the previous presidents Gaddafi had dealt with. He was tough, determined, and deeply suspicious of anyone who challenged American power. They'd banned the import of Libyan oil and prohibited American companies from doing business with the Gaddafi government. They also began to freeze Libyan assets in American banks. He purchased billions of dollars worth of Soviet weapons, including advanced fighter planes, tanks, and missiles. He also started to develop closer relationships with other countries that were opposed to American influence, including Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. She had been controlling a peaceful protest when shots were fired from inside the embassy building. Her death caused international outrage and led to a complete breakdown in relations between Libya and Britain. The targets included military bases, government buildings, and Gaddafi's own residence in Tripoli. The attack was designed to kill Gaddafi and destroy his ability to support terrorism. The sound of jet engines and exploding bombs filled the night sky. Buildings were destroyed, fires burned across the cities, and dozens of people were killed. When he appeared on television the next day, he was angry but unbroken. He declared that the American attack had only made him stronger and more determined to fight against imperialism. He promised that Libya would never surrender to foreign pressure. Among the victims was Gaddafi's adopted daughter Hannah, who was just 15 months old when she died in the attack. The Americans hoped that without their leader, the Libyan government would collapse. The message was clear: as long as Gaddafi supported terrorism, Libya would be treated as an enemy. This massive system of pipes and pumps was designed to bring water from ancient underground sources in the Sahara Desert to the coastal cities where most Libyans lived. Gaddafi called it the eighth wonder of the world and claimed it would transform North Africa. But Gaddafi also wanted to show the world that his country could achieve great things despite international sanctions. He portrayed the water project as proof that Libya was building a better future for its people while the West was trying to destroy it. Instead of weakening Gaddafi, it seemed to strengthen his position. Many Libyans who had been critical of their leader now rallied around him, seeing him as the victim of unprovoked aggression. He portrayed himself as a small country's leader who had stood up to the superpower and lived to tell about it. He appeared at international conferences wearing bandages and claiming to be injured in the attack, though there was no evidence that he had actually been hurt. He had survived an assassination attempt by the world's most powerful military, but he had also become increasingly isolated from the international community. The stage was set for an even more dramatic confrontation in the decade to come. Even some foreign governments that had been critical of Libya condemned the American attack as excessive. He also began trying to acquire nuclear weapons technology, reaching out to countries like Pakistan and North Korea for help. The Americans watched these developments with growing alarm, but they were reluctant to launch another direct military attack. Many of the victims were American soldiers. The United States quickly concluded that Libya was responsible for the attack, and President Reagan decided that the time had come for military action. When Reagan looked at Gaddafi, he saw a dangerous terrorist who needed to be stopped. Gaddafi became more isolated but also more determined to prove that he could not be intimidated. He continued to support revolutionary movements around the world and began to develop new and more dangerous weapons. When Gaddafi looked at Reagan, he saw everything he hated about American imperialism. Libyan fighter jets rose to meet them, and in the brief air battle that followed, 2 Libyan planes were shot down. The pilots were killed, but Gaddafi's response was defiant. He appeared on television and radio, declaring that Libya would never back down from defending its territory. The line of death remained, he said, and the Americans would pay a price for crossing it. Their first major confrontation came in 1981 in the waters off the Libyan coast. In August 1981, American Navy planes flew deliberately across Gaddafi's line of death, but the confrontation was just beginning. Throughout the early 1980s, Gaddafi continued to support revolutionary groups around the world. He sent money and weapons to fighters in Ireland, Palestine, Africa, and South America. He opened training camps in the Libyan desert where guerrilla fighters learned how to make bombs and carry out attacks. He truly believed he was leading a global revolution against oppression. The Americans saw things very differently. They accused Gaddafi of being the world's leading sponsor of terrorism. In 1982, the United States imposed economic sanctions on Libya. Gaddafi's response was to become even more defiant. He began to forge closer ties with the Soviet Union. Libya's ideological enemy during the Cold War, the situation became more dangerous in 1984 when a British policewoman named Yvonne Fletcher was killed outside the Libyan embassy in London. But the most serious crisis came in 1986. In April of that year, a bomb exploded in a nightclub in Berlin, Germany, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. On the night of April 15, 1986, American warplanes launched a massive bombing attack on Libya. The bombing raid was a terrifying experience for the people of Tripoli and Benghazi, but Gaddafi himself survived. He had been in his compound when the bombs fell, but he managed to escape to a safe location. The bombing had the opposite effect from what the Americans had hoped. Gaddafi used his survival to enhance his image as a hero of the developing world. The rest of the 1980s saw a continued escalation of tensions between Libya and the West. He started a program to develop chemical weapons, building secret factories in the desert where deadly gases could be produced. Gaddafi also began construction of one of the most ambitious engineering projects in history, the Great Man-Made River. The project was partly practical and partly propaganda. Libya genuinely needed more water for its growing population. By the end of the 1980s, Gaddafi had become one of the most famous and controversial leaders in the world. December 21, 1988 was supposed to be a day of joy and celebration. Christmas was just 4 days away, and hundreds of people were traveling to be with their families for the holidays. Pan Am Flight 103 was carrying 259 passengers and crew members from London to New York. Most of them were Americans heading home for Christmas. They had no idea that they were about to become victims of one of the most shocking terrorist attacks in history. Lattes, luggage, and pieces of the airplane were found in fields, forests, and gardens. The investigation that followed would become one of the largest and most complex criminal investigations in history. At exactly 7:03 in the evening, as the Boeing 747 flew over the small Scottish town of Lockerbie, a bomb exploded in the cargo hold. The pattern of the wreckage suggested that a bomb had destroyed the plane. Within days, forensic experts had found traces of explosives in the debris. Someone had deliberately murdered 270 innocent people, but who was responsible and why had they done it? Intelligence agencies had records of phone calls between the suspects and their handlers in Tripoli. Witnesses in Malta identified al-Megrahi as the man who had bought the radio. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi absolutely refused to hand over the two suspects. He claimed that Libya had nothing to do with the bombing and that his agents were innocent. He accused the Western powers of trying to frame Libya for a crime it did not commit. The timing of their travels matched perfectly with the preparation and execution of the bombing. And without the ability to buy new equipment or spare parts, the oil industry began to deteriorate. The country's infrastructure started to crumble. Hospitals ran short of medicine. Schools lacked basic supplies. The Libyan people, who had enjoyed one of the highest standards of living in Africa, began to suffer real hardship. The massive plane broke apart in the sky, raining debris over the countryside below. The device had been manufactured in Switzerland and sold to a company in Malta. The Great Man-Made River project continued to expand, bringing water from deep underground sources to coastal cities. New roads, schools, and hospitals were built using oil revenues. Gaddafi wanted to prove that Libya could survive and thrive without the help of the Western world. When police traced the purchase, they discovered that it had been bought by a man using a false passport. The trail led to two Libyan intelligence agents, Abdelbesset al-Megrahi and Lamine Khalifa Fima. Children died from diseases that could have been easily treated with proper medicine. Students could not travel abroad for education. Families were separated because flights were banned. Even his closest allies started to question whether the sacrifice was worth it. Some of his advisors quietly suggested that it might be time to consider handing over the two suspects in exchange for relief from the sanctions. But Gaddafi was determined to show that he could not be forced to surrender. Gaddafi could say that he had not surrendered to Western pressure because the trial was taking place in a neutral country. The British and Americans could claim that justice would be served because the suspects would face trial under Scottish law. The isolation was taking a terrible toll on the Libyan people. In 1992, the United Nations Security Council imposed the harshest sanctions ever placed on a single country. As their plane took off from Tripoli, many Libyans hoped that their long nightmare of isolation was finally coming to an end. But the shadow of Lockerbie would continue to hang over Gaddafi and Libya for many years to come. He appeared at public events wearing bizarre costumes and making strange speeches. He seemed to be losing touch with reality, talking about conspiracies and plots that existed only in his imagination. Some observers wondered if the pressure was finally getting to him. All flights to and from Libya were banned. Libyan assets around the world were frozen. The sale of oil equipment to Libya was prohibited. The country was effectively cut off from the rest of the world. All 259 people on board died instantly. 11 more people on the ground were killed when parts of the plane crashed into their homes. They examined every piece of wreckage, interviewed thousands of witnesses, and followed clues around the world. The United Nations, the Arab League, and the Organization of African Unity all tried to mediate between Libya and the Western powers. Nelson Mandela, the respected leader of South Africa, became personally involved in the negotiations. But he insisted on conditions. The trial would take place in a neutral country, the Netherlands, but under Scottish law. The judges would be Scottish, but the location would be a former American airbase that had been designated as Scottish territory for the purposes of the trial. He visited Gaddafi several times and urged him to find a way to end the standoff. Slowly, a picture began to emerge that pointed toward Libya. He claimed that the Western powers were trying to destroy his country because it had dared to challenge their domination of the world. He organized massive rallies where thousands of Libyans chanted their support for their leader and their defiance of foreign pressure. He began to focus more attention on Africa, positioning himself as a champion of African unity and development. He provided aid to struggling African countries and supported liberation movements across the continent. He dreamed of creating a United States of Africa with himself as its leader. The quiet town of Lockerbie became the scene of unimaginable horror. The world watched in shock as rescue workers searched through the wreckage scattered across miles of Scottish countryside. From the beginning, investigators suspected that this was not an accident. The investigation took years to complete. Police officers and intelligence agents from Scotland, England, and the United States worked together to piece together what had happened. The breakthrough came when investigators found fragments of a radio cassette player that had contained the bomb. The evidence against the two Libyans was complex but convincing. But proving that Libya was responsible was one thing. Getting justice was another matter entirely. The international community was outraged by Gaddafi's refusal to cooperate. For Gaddafi, the sanctions were a disaster. Libya's economy depended entirely on oil exports. But the colonel was too proud to give in. He portrayed the sanctions as an attack on Libya's sovereignty and dignity. Gaddafi also tried to break out of his isolation by reaching out to other parts of the world. The colonel also launched ambitious projects to show that Libya could prosper despite the sanctions. But the human cost of the sanctions was enormous. Ordinary Libyans suffered while their leader remained defiant. As the 1990s progressed, the pressure on Gaddafi began to mount. The colonel's behavior during this period became increasingly erratic. International efforts to resolve the crisis continued throughout the decade. The breakthrough finally came in 1998 when Gaddafi agreed to hand over the two suspects for trial. It was a face-saving compromise that allowed all sides to claim victory. On April 5, 1999, the two Libyan suspects were finally handed over to Scottish authorities. The year 1999 marked the beginning of the most surprising chapter in Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's long and controversial career. The man who had been branded as the world's most dangerous terrorist was about to transform himself into an unlikely partner of the very countries that had once tried to destroy him. It was a dramatic change that few people saw coming, but it would reshape not only Libya, but the entire Middle East. For years, he had refused to give up Abdel Basset al-Megrahi and Lamine Khalifa Fhimma, but the economic sanctions were slowly strangling his country. The Libyan people were suffering, and even his closest advisors were beginning to question whether the fight was worth the cost. The first sign of change came when Gaddafi finally agreed to hand over the two Libyan suspects in the Lockerbie bombing case. The handover of the suspects was a carefully orchestrated event. On April 5, 1999, a special airplane carrying the two men took off from Tripoli and landed in the Netherlands. President George W. Bush declared a global war on terrorism and began dividing the world into two camps, those who were with America and those who were against it. For Gaddafi, this created both a dangerous threat and an unexpected opportunity. Groups like al-Qaeda considered him a false Muslim who had betrayed the true faith by working with Western countries. They had already tried to assassinate him several times, and he knew that if they gained more power, Libya could become their next target. Gaddafi had insisted that the trial take place on neutral ground, and the Dutch government had agreed to provide a former American airbase for the proceedings. The real test would come when the world saw whether Gaddafi was truly ready to change his ways, or whether this was just another one of his clever diplomatic games. Libya, he declared, was giving up all of its weapons of mass destruction. The country would abandon its nuclear weapons program, destroy its chemical weapons stockpiles, and eliminate its long-range missiles. International inspectors would be allowed to verify that everything was being dismantled. The answer would come in the form of an event that nobody expected: the September 11, 2001 attacks on the United States. He had spent billions of dollars and many years trying to develop them. He believed that having such weapons would make Libya stronger and more respected. But he also realized that in the post-9/11 world, possessing weapons of mass destruction made him a target for American military action. Foreign companies brought in new technology and expertise. The country's gross domestic product soared as money began flowing in from around the world. The United Nations began lifting the sanctions that had isolated Libya for over a decade. New roads, airports, and hotels were built to accommodate the growing number of foreign visitors. The coastal cities of Tripoli and Benghazi were transformed with modern buildings and infrastructure. He toned down his revolutionary rhetoric and started appearing at international conferences as a respectable world leader. He met with presidents and prime ministers from around the world, discussing trade deals and diplomatic cooperation. The man who had once been considered too dangerous to deal with was now welcomed in capitals across Europe and beyond. Libya began to look like a normal, prosperous country rather than an isolated pariah state. European countries reopened their embassies in Tripoli and began negotiating new trade agreements. American companies started planning investments in Libya's oil industry. It was a face-saving compromise that allowed all sides to claim victory. But Gaddafi cooperated fully with the inspectors, allowing them to go wherever they wanted and see whatever they needed to see. But the important thing was that he was there at all. The man who had once been America's most wanted terrorist was now addressing the world's most important international forum as a legitimate head of state. He had always seen himself as a champion of African unity, but now he had the resources and international respectability to make real progress toward that goal. He provided billions of dollars in aid to African countries and helped establish new continental institutions. The country was prosperous, stable, and increasingly integrated into the global community. Gaddafi himself seemed to have evolved from a dangerous radical into a quirky but manageable leader. Few people could have predicted that within a year, everything would come crashing down in the most dramatic way possible. It was a complete reversal of his previous policy of secrecy and defiance. It was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream for the man who had grown up in the African desert. He used his position to promote his vision of a United States of Africa, complete with a single currency, a unified military, and a continental government. The country's nuclear program was more advanced than most people had realized. There were centrifuges for enriching uranium, designs for nuclear weapons, and even some weapons-grade materials. In 2009, he was allowed to visit New York to address the United Nations General Assembly. It was his first trip to America in decades, and it marked a complete transformation of his international status. The chemical weapons program was also extensive, with thousands of tons of deadly chemicals stored in secret facilities. But giving up the suspects was just the beginning. When hijacked airplanes crashed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killing nearly 3,000 people, the world changed forever. The colonel could have chosen to celebrate the attacks or to support America's enemies. Many of his supporters expected him to do exactly that. Instead, he surprised everyone by becoming one of the first world leaders to condemn the attacks and offer help to the United States. He opened Libya's intelligence files to American investigators and provided valuable information about terrorist networks that he had once supported. This cooperation was not just a political calculation. Gaddafi had genuine reasons to fear the spread of Islamic extremism. The colonel's most dramatic gesture came in December 2003 when he made an announcement that shocked the world. The decision to give up these weapons was not easy for Gaddafi. The weapons inspectors who arrived in Libya found more than they had expected. The dismantling process took several years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. The international community responded to these changes with amazement and cautious optimism. The economic benefits of reconciliation were immediate and dramatic. Libya's oil production, which had been declining for years due to lack of investment and modern equipment, began to recover. Gaddafi used this new wealth to launch ambitious development projects. The colonel also began to change his international image. But perhaps the most significant change was in Gaddafi's relationship with Africa. In 2009, Gaddafi was elected chairman of the African Union, the continent's most important political organization. The colonel's newfound respectability even extended to his relationship with the United States. During his UN speech, Gaddafi spoke for over an hour and a half, rambling about various topics and occasionally making bizarre statements. By 2010, Libya appeared to be a success story of diplomatic engagement and economic reform. By the end of 2010, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi had been ruling Libya for more than 40 years. He was one of the longest-serving leaders in the world, and most Libyans had never known life without him. The country seemed stable and prosperous, with new buildings rising in the cities and oil money flowing into government coffers. On December 17, 2010, a young fruit seller named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire to protest the corruption and humiliation he faced from government officials. His desperate act sparked demonstrations that spread across Tunisia and eventually brought down the government of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, who had ruled for 23 years. If a dictator who had seemed so secure could be overthrown by popular protests, then perhaps other long-serving leaders were not as safe as they appeared. The wave of demonstrations that followed became known as the Arab Spring, and it would change the Middle East forever. But beneath the surface of apparent calm, powerful forces were building that would soon destroy everything Gaddafi had built. The trouble began not in Libya, but in a small town in Tunisia called Sidi Bouzid. On February 15, 2011, a human rights lawyer named Fathi Turbel was arrested by government security forces in the eastern city of Benghazi. Turbel had been representing families of prisoners who had been killed in a massacre at Abu Salam prison in 1996. When they heard that their lawyer had been arrested, they gathered outside the police station to demand his release. The crowd grew larger as word spread through the city. By evening, hundreds of people were chanting slogans and calling for an end to corruption and oppression. Soldiers were beginning to defect from the army, taking their weapons with them. Government officials were fleeing the country or switching sides. The revolution was spreading faster than anyone had expected. His arrest was meant to be a routine intimidation tactic, but it had the opposite effect. On February 22, 2011, he appeared on television to address the nation. The speech was broadcast from the ruins of his old compound, which had been damaged in the 1986 American bombing raid. The symbolism was intentional. He was reminding people that he had survived attacks from the world's most powerful military. He ordered his most loyal military units to attack the protesters with tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Instead of rallying his supporters, it convinced many people that he had lost touch with reality. His threats of violence frightened ordinary citizens and pushed more people to join the opposition. Even some of his closest advisors began to question whether he could survive this crisis. He hired foreign mercenaries from African countries to supplement his forces. He warned that Libya was on the brink of civil war and that the country might be divided into separate regions. He claimed that the protests were part of a foreign conspiracy and that the government would use all necessary force to maintain order. The eastern part of the country, including the cities of Benghazi and Tobruk, fell under rebel control. Opposition groups formed the National Transitional Council and declared themselves to be the legitimate government of Libya. Meanwhile, Gaddafi's forces regrouped in the west, preparing for a long and bloody conflict. The speech destroyed any remaining hope that the Gaddafi family might be willing to negotiate with the opposition. He was determined to crush the rebellion before it could spread to the capital city of Tripoli. The man who had once seemed invincible was fighting for his survival against his own people. The revolution that had begun with the arrest of a single lawyer had grown into a nationwide uprising that threatened to destroy everything he had built over 4 decades of rule. Sassif had been educated in Britain and was seen by many as a potential reformer who might modernize Libya's political system. His speech was expected to offer concessions that might calm the situation. The United Nations Security Council met in emergency session to discuss possible responses. The European Union began considering economic sanctions. The United States started planning for various contingencies, including the possibility of military intervention. But instead of scaring people away, the violence only made them angrier. He spoke for over an hour, blaming the protests on foreign agents, drug addicts, and Islamic extremists. He claimed that the demonstrators were not real Libyans but foreign infiltrators who were trying to destroy the country. He promised to hunt down the rebels house by house and fight to the last drop of blood. Several Arab countries recalled their ambassadors from Tripoli and called for an end to the violence against protesters. The African Union, which Gaddafi had led just 2 years earlier, also began to waver in its support. The next day, even more people took to the streets, and the protests began to spread to other cities in eastern Libya. He had survived many crises over the decades, and he believed that Libya was different from other Arab nations. His people were more prosperous, he told himself, and they were grateful for everything he had done for them. Many Libyans, especially young people, were frustrated by the lack of political freedom and economic opportunity. They watched the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt with growing excitement and began to wonder if change was possible in their own country too. He had given them free education, free health care, and a share of the country's oil wealth. Why would they want to rebel against him? The fall of Ben Ali sent shockwaves across the Arab world. At first, Gaddafi was not too worried about what was happening in neighboring countries. But the colonel had misjudged the mood of his people. The spark that ignited the Libyan revolution came from an unexpected source. The families of the Abu Salam victims had been waiting for years for justice. The government's response was swift and brutal. Security forces opened fire on the protesters, killing several people and wounding many more. Gaddafi watched these developments with growing alarm. He had dealt with small-scale protests before, but this was different. Entire neighborhoods were rising up against his rule. The colonel's first instinct was to fight back with maximum force. But Gaddafi also tried to use his skills as a public speaker to rally support for his government. The speech was vintage, Gaddafi, rambling, passionate, and increasingly unhinged. The speech had the opposite effect from what Gaddafi intended. The situation became even worse when Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, appeared on television the next day. Instead, Saif delivered an even more threatening message than his father. As February 2011 progressed, it became clear that Libya was sliding toward full-scale war. The international community watched with growing concern as the situation deteriorated. The Arab League, which had often supported Gaddafi in the past, began to distance itself from his regime. By the end of February 2011, it was clear that Gaddafi faced the greatest challenge of his political career. The year 2011 had started like any other for Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. He was still the undisputed ruler of Libya, still commanding respect on the international stage, still believing that his revolution would last forever. But by March, he was fighting for his life against a nationwide rebellion that threatened to destroy everything he had built over 4 decades of rule. This resolution authorized the use of military force to protect Libyan civilians from Gaddafi's attacks. It was a dramatic decision that would change the course of the conflict and ultimately seal the colonel's fate. The Arab League's endorsement of international intervention gave the UN resolution crucial legitimacy and made it harder for countries like Russia and China to oppose it. French fighter jets attacked Gaddafi's forces near the rebel stronghold of Benghazi, destroying tanks and armored vehicles that had been advancing on the city. It was the beginning of what would become a 7-month military campaign that would fundamentally change the balance of power in Libya. He had spent his entire adult life building his power base, and he was determined to fight to the end. His forces adapted to the new reality by hiding their heavy weapons and blending in with civilian populations. They fought a guerrilla war from the cities and towns they controlled, making it difficult for NATO aircraft to target them without risking civilian casualties. The turning point came on March 17, 2011, when the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973. He communicated with his commanders through a network of messengers and trusted intermediaries. He appeared on television and radio less frequently, and when he did, his speeches became more desperate and bizarre. His most loyal forces fought with the courage of men who knew they had nothing left to lose. Gaddafi continued to appear on television and radio, delivering increasingly desperate messages to his people. He claimed that the rebels were foreign agents who were trying to destroy Libya. He accused NATO of being modern-day crusaders who wanted to steal Libya's oil. He promised that he would never surrender and would fight until the last breath. Government officials continued to defect to the rebel side, taking valuable intelligence with them. Foreign mercenaries became harder to recruit and pay. The economic sanctions imposed by the international community were making it difficult to buy weapons and supplies. Many of them were from his own tribe or from communities that had benefited greatly from his rule. The assault was carefully coordinated with NATO airstrikes and supported by sleeper cells that had been operating inside the capital for months. Government forces, weakened by months of fighting and low on supplies, were unable to mount an effective defense. The front lines shifted constantly, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. Rebel forces, supported by NATO airstrikes, slowly fought their way through the city street by street. The battle was brutal and destructive, with both sides fighting with desperate intensity. Many of the city's buildings were destroyed, and thousands of civilians fled to escape the fighting. He retreated to his hometown of Sirte, a coastal city that had been transformed during his rule from a small fishing village into a modern urban center. As they advanced through the city, they discovered that Gaddafi was trying to escape in a convoy of vehicles. NATO aircraft attacked the convoy, forcing the survivors to take shelter in drainage pipes outside the city. It was here that he decided to make his final stand, surrounded by his most loyal supporters and the remnants of his once powerful military. The fighting was particularly intense around strategic locations like the oil refineries at Ras Lanuf and the crossroads town of Idabia. The exact details of what happened next remain unclear, but within hours, Muammar Gaddafi was dead. His body was displayed in a shopping center in the city of Misrata, where crowds of people came to see for themselves that the dictator who had seemed invincible was finally gone. For decades, this had been the site of Gaddafi's most important speeches and rallies. He was accompanied by a small group of bodyguards and advisors who had remained loyal to him until the end. He had been one of the last surviving leaders from the generation that had come to power in the 1960s and 1970s. His fall completed the transformation of the Middle East that had begun with the Arab Spring. But it also raised questions about what would come next for Libya and its people. According to later accounts, he seemed to have accepted that his time was over but was determined to die fighting rather than surrender. Now rebel fighters were tearing down his statues and burning his portraits. The images were broadcast around the world, showing that the colonel's grip on power was finally broken. They believed that if Gaddafi fell, they would face revenge from their enemies. They used satellite phones, internet connections, and social media to tell their story to the world. They documented government atrocities with video cameras and broadcast their struggle on international television. The information war was as important as the military campaign. The resolution was the result of intense diplomatic pressure from countries like France, Britain, and the United States. They had advanced fighter jets, precision-guided missiles, and sophisticated surveillance equipment. Gaddafi's military, despite decades of arms purchases from various countries, was no match for this modern arsenal. Within days, the Libyan Air Force had been effectively destroyed, and government forces were being attacked wherever they moved. They had watched with horror as Gaddafi's forces used tanks, artillery, and aircraft against civilian protesters. Reports of mass killings and human rights abuses had shocked the international community and created pressure for action. But the resolution was also made possible by the support of Arab countries, which had grown tired of Gaddafi's erratic behavior and were embarrassed by his brutal response to the protests. On March 19, 2011, just 2 days after the UN vote, the first coalition airstrikes began. The coalition forces, led by NATO, had overwhelming technological superiority. But Gaddafi was not ready to give up. The colonel himself became increasingly isolated and paranoid. He moved from location to location, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. Despite the overwhelming odds against him, Gaddafi's resistance was fierce and determined. The conflict became a grinding war of attrition. Cities changed hands multiple times as government and rebel forces advanced and retreated across the desert landscape. The psychological warfare was equally important. The rebels, meanwhile, were learning to use modern communication technology to spread their message. As the months passed, the strain began to show on Gaddafi's regime. The beginning of the end came in August 2011, when rebel forces launched a surprise attack on Tripoli. The symbolic moment came when rebels overran Green Square in the heart of Tripoli, but Gaddafi himself had escaped from the capital before it fell. The siege of Sirte lasted for more than 2 months. Gaddafi spent his final weeks in underground bunkers and safe houses, moving constantly to avoid capture. On October 20, 2011, rebel forces finally broke through the last government defenses in Sirte. It was there that the man who had ruled Libya for 42 years was finally captured. The death of Gaddafi marked the end of an era, not just for Libya, but for the entire Arab world. More than a decade has passed since Colonel Muammar Gaddafi died in the dusty streets of Sirte, but his shadow still hangs over Libya and the wider world. The man who once seemed larger than life has become a subject of intense debate and conflicting memories. Was he a visionary leader who lifted his people out of poverty, or was he a brutal dictator who crushed their freedom? The answer, like the man himself, is far more complicated than most people realize. To understand Gaddafi's legacy, we must first look at what Libya was like before he came to power and what it became during his rule. When he seized control in 1969, Libya was one of the poorest countries in the world. Most people lived in poverty, illiteracy was widespread, and life expectancy was low. The country had oil, but most of the profits went to foreign companies and corrupt officials. Thousands of people were imprisoned, tortured, or killed for opposing the regime. The colonel's secret police, known as the Revolutionary Committees, monitored every aspect of citizens' lives. Free speech, free press, and free assembly were unknown concepts. Under Gaddafi's rule, Libya was transformed into the most prosperous country in Africa. The great man-made river, which he called the eighth wonder of the world, brought water from ancient aquifers deep in the Sahara to coastal cities where most people lived. The Abu Salim prison massacre of 1996, where more than 1,000 prisoners were killed, was just the most notorious example. Dissidents were hanged in public squares, opposition leaders were assassinated abroad, and entire communities were punished for the actions of a few individuals. New roads connected remote communities to the rest of the country. Modern airports and seaports facilitated trade and travel. His rambling speeches, strange costumes, and unpredictable actions made him a figure of ridicule in many parts of the world. Thousands of people have been killed in the fighting that followed the colonel's death. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced from their homes. The country has become a major route for human trafficking, with desperate migrants from across Africa facing terrible conditions as they try to reach Europe. Production fell from 1.6 million barrels per day in 2010 to less than 200,000 barrels per day at some points. This economic disaster has made life much harder for ordinary Libyans, many of whom now struggle to find work or provide for their families. The security vacuum created by the colonel's death allowed these groups to establish strongholds in parts of the country. They carried out brutal attacks on civilians and threatened to spread their influence across North Africa. What might have been seen as eccentricity in a private citizen was viewed as dangerous instability in a national leader. Some Libyans, particularly older people who remember the stability and prosperity of the Gaddafi era, have expressed nostalgia for their former leader. They point out that whatever his faults, at least the country was united and peaceful under his rule. The bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lock Arbe killed 270 innocent people and devastated families around the world. His transformation from a young revolutionary with genuine ideals into an aging dictator who had lost touch with his people shows how power can corrupt even those who begin with good intentions. The country that had once been stable and prosperous descended into chaos and civil war. The NATO bombing campaign that helped bring down his regime was justified as a humanitarian intervention, but it also contributed to the instability that followed. The Libya experience has influenced debates about when and how the international community should intervene in other conflicts. Competing militias fought for control of cities and oil fields. Two rival governments claimed to be the legitimate authority. The economy collapsed and basic services like electricity and water became unreliable. They blamed the international community for failing to help Libya build democratic institutions after the revolution. Some remember him as a champion of the poor and oppressed who gave his people dignity and prosperity. While the theory was never successfully implemented, it raised important questions about democracy, economic justice, and political participation that remain relevant today. They also point to the destructive role played by regional powers who have supported different factions in the ongoing conflict. Gaddafi was a man of contradictions who achieved remarkable things while also committing terrible crimes. He was a visionary who saw the potential for African unity and Third World solidarity, but also a paranoid dictator who destroyed anyone who threatened his power. His support for various terrorist groups resulted in countless other deaths and injuries. While he later renounced terrorism and cooperated with international authorities, the damage had been done. The boy who grew up herding goats in the Libyan desert became one of the most influential and controversial leaders of the 20th century. Whether that influence was ultimately positive or negative may depend on whether Libya can eventually overcome its current challenges and build a stable, democratic future. It will be determined by the choices made by the Libyan people and the international community in the years to come. Only time will tell whether the revolution that brought him down will ultimately lead to the freedom and prosperity that so many Libyans sacrificed their lives to achieve. His vision of African unity, while never fully realized, anticipated many of the continent's current challenges and opportunities. His criticism of Western dominance and his support for the global South resonated with many people in developing countries who felt excluded from the global economy. The colonel used oil revenues to build a comprehensive welfare state that provided free education, free healthcare, and free housing to all citizens. Literacy rates soared, life expectancy increased dramatically, and Libya achieved the highest standard of living on the African continent. The numbers tell an impressive story. Before Gaddafi, fewer than 20% of Libyans could read and write. By 2011, literacy rates had reached over 90%. The country had gone from having almost no universities to having dozens of higher education institutions. Women, who had been largely excluded from public life, made up more than half of university students, and many worked as doctors, teachers, and engineers. Libya's infrastructure was also transformed during Gaddafi's rule, but these achievements came at a terrible cost. Gaddafi's Libya was a police state where political opposition was ruthlessly suppressed. The regime's human rights abuses were systematic and horrific. Gaddafi's support for international terrorism also left a dark stain on his legacy. The colonel's erratic behavior and bizarre public statements also contributed to his negative image. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of Gaddafi's legacy is what happened to Libya after his death. The human cost of post-Gaddafi Libya has been enormous. Libya's oil production, which had been the foundation of the country's prosperity, collapsed after Gaddafi's death. The rise of extremist groups like ISIS in post-Gaddafi Libya has also been a major concern. These developments have led some people to question whether Gaddafi's removal was worth the cost. But others argue that the chaos that followed Gaddafi's death was not inevitable. The debate over Gaddafi's legacy extends beyond Libya's borders. The colonel's third universal theory, outlined in his Green Book, was an attempt to find an alternative to both capitalism and communism. Gaddafi's story also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the importance of accountable governance. The international community's response to Gaddafi also raises important questions about intervention and sovereignty. As Libya continues to struggle with the aftermath of revolution and civil war, the memory of Muammar Gaddafi remains a powerful and divisive force. The truth, as always, is more complex than either of these simple narratives suggests. His legacy reminds us that history is not a simple story of heroes and villains, but a complex tapestry of human ambition, idealism, and failure. The final chapter of Gaddafi's story has yet to be written.